During the Russo-Ukraine War, a word commonly used in Ukraine was called Ukrainian glory. Let's start with this word today. In March 2022, Zelensky delivered a speech in the U.S. Congress, which was regarded by many Chinese as Song Miling's speech in the U.S. Congress. At this time, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi chanted Slava Ukraini at the beginning of the event, glory to Ukraine, no less than 5 times. The expression then became popular in Washington, London, and elsewhere, with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking out in House of Commons meetings and on Twitter. U.S. President Joe Biden invested tens of billions of dollars worth of military equipment in Ukraine in order to defend the freedom and dignity of this country. But what does the phrase glory to Ukraine really mean? The term originated with Ukrainian fascist leader Stepan Bandel, and Ukrainian glory was part of a salute by members of the Ukrainian nationalist group and its military. The Ukrainian Nazis collectively massacred tens of thousands of Soviets, Jews, and Poles during World War II, and the Poles are still hard to let go. Therefore, when the United States, Jewish descendants, Poland, and European countries shouted glory belongs to Ukraine, the fate of Ukraine has long been doomed. Have they collectively forgotten history? Of course it is impossible. The history of the past 30 years is enough to prove everything. The United States, the European Union, and any of their associated institutions have never forgotten, or have ever forgotten, this enmity that has economically strangled the Ukrainian people for decades, without exception. With 44.13 million inhabitants, Ukraine will be the poorest or second poorest country in Europe as measured by GDP per capita until the beginning of 2022. Competing with Ukraine for the title of poorest country is only about 2.6 million. According to the survey, there is a huge gap between the rich and the poor in the country, with the bottom 50% of Ukraine's population receiving only 22.6% of the country's total income and 5.7% of its wealth. According to the World Inequality Database, the top 10% own nearly 60% of Ukraine's personal net worth. The database is led by 3 of the world's leading inequality experts, Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Seth, and Gabriel Zuckerman. In 2018, Ukrainian households had an average net savings of negative $245. You read that right, negative numbers, negative numbers, negative numbers. Ukraine's median household income is about $4,400 a year, which is comparable to that in Iran, whose economy has been operating under severe sanctions for years. The average wage in Ukraine is estimated to be only €330 per month, and the state minimum wage for workers is €144. According to the Ukrainian government, a person should be able to live on less than half of this figure, as the minimum living allowance is €64. Retirees at the bottom of the pension level receive €50 per month. The World Inequality Database reports that the typical Ukrainian household spends 47% of its total income on food and another 32% on utility bills. However, Ukraine has the strongest nuclear power in Europe, the most abundant hydropower and the wealthiest coal mines. In 2016, nearly 60% of the population was poor by government standards, including 60% of children. In 2019, the poverty rate fell only to 37.8%. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations found that in 2020, 15.9% of Ukrainian children under the age of 5 were malnourished, and in 2019, 17.7% of women of reproductive age were anemic, caused by a lack of iron in the diet, and 24% of the population suffered from obesity. This number has been rising steadily since 2004. However, Ukraine also has the richest black land in the world. Between 2014 and 2019, the birth rate fell by 19.4%. Ukraine's death rate is extremely high, 14.7 per 1,000 people, far higher than many countries in Africa, the world's poorest continent. According to World Bank statistics, its suicide rate ranks 11th in the world. The country's population has shrunk every year since 1993, as deaths outnumber births by more than 2 to 1 and hundreds of thousands emigrate each year in search of a better life. Ukrainian citizens have decreased by 8 million after 30 years of independence. Apart from a concentration of the super-rich in the big cities and a small upper-middle class, Ukraine is a sea of poverty. What? This is a direct result of the economic policies imposed on the country by those countries that claim to love Ukraine today. In an immediate sense, the current situation has its roots in the Uzbek coup in 2014 that brought the government in Kiev to power and immediately signed an association agreement with the EU, requiring it to impose tough austerity measures. But it also has deeper roots. The country's social and economic catastrophe dates back to the end of 1991, when the Soviet bureaucracy collapsed and all newly independent nation-states returned to capitalism and fully integrated into global financial and trade networks. Nationalized property was transferred into private hands through a series of policies collectively known as shock therapy, developed in close cooperation with Western advisors. Former Communist Party officials and their children, economic managers and directors of the main Soviet factories and industrial sectors, and criminal elements active in the shadow economy, at the expense of the working masses through blatant theft and cheap sale of Soviet resources, victory was achieved. The sabotage has seen the emergence of competing factions of big business in Ukraine centered on Donetsk in the east and Dnepropetrovsk in the west, with coal mining and processing, energy production and transportation, and metallurgy as their main wealth source. Consumer goods and agriculture quickly realized new sources of profit as banking and media empires emerged. From this period, the ranks of Ukrainian billionaires began to grow. Viktor Pinchuk, $1.9 billion. Rinat Akhmetov, $7.6 billion. Igor Kolomoisky, $1.8 billion. Hennady Boholyubov, $1.1 billion. Petro Poroshenko, $1.6 billion. Vadim Nowinski, $1.4 billion, and more. For decades, Ukrainian politics has been plagued by conflicts, alliances, coalition splits and conflicts over whether the country will forge closer economic ties with Europe, maintain strong ties with Russia, or somehow be neutral. The problems are intertwined. Ukraine is seen as a key area of contention as geopolitical tensions rise between Washington and Moscow and war breaks out. In the 1990s, despite accumulating huge sums of money on the one hand, the Ukrainian economy plummeted. Between 1993 and 1999, its per capita GDP fell by 8.4%, making it one of the worst economies in Europe. Inflation got completely out of control at times, reaching an annual high of about 376% in 1995, thereby wiping out the saving and spending power of Ukrainian workers early in the market recovery process. Political economist Yulia Yurchenko argues in her 2018 book Ukraine and the Empire of Capital. Many young people who lacked choice in the early 1990s joined gangs and were used as pawns in the criminals' journey to build their fortunes, and wars between rival business families sometimes produced dead bodies on the streets. She noted that between 1988 and 1997 crime had tripled and a half, mainly due to various forms of theft, robbery, fraud, and extortion as well as bribery, forgery and drug dealing. During this period, Ukraine received 10 loans from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank and has since fallen into a debt trap, the beginning of almost continuous borrowing from international financial institutions in the 2000s and 2010s. The terms of the loan center around a 1994 Memorandum on Economic Policy and Strategic Issues signed between Ukraine and the IMF, which, in Yurchenko's words, effectively limits the Ukrainian government's decision-making power. Agreements drafted with other international financial institutions, such as the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, on the basis of the principle of cross-conditionality, that is, creditors develop mutually consistent and mutually reinforcing clauses, also impose similar restrictions. These clauses tighten the noose around the necks of loan recipients in multiple directions. Lenders are pressing the Kiev government to end policies that create obstacles to foreign trade, including remove price controls, reduce state budget deficits, and cut subsidies to unproductive industries. Improving manufacturing competitiveness by modernizing factories and laying off workers. Privatize more state property. Budget cuts by targeting social programs and pensions. And a value-added taxes imposed so that more of the sales revenue falls on consumers rather than businesses. While these processes sometimes speed up and slash or slow down, depending on whether the Kiev government is more aligned with the US or more with Russia, each Ukrainian government is a partner in fulfilling global capital needs. Ukraine's ruling class rose from the ruins of the collapse of the Soviet Union and is a comprador class in the most complete sense. In 1998, for example, the Ukrainian parliament authorized President Kukma to cut government spending by 30%, doing so because the IMF told the country to do so. An August 1998 article in the Financial Times noted, in addition to meeting fiscal and monetary targets, the government must pass legislation on privatization, tax reform, restructuring of the energy and agricultural sectors, and cleaning up its vast shadow economy.